So having good, elevated, high vagal tone is the same thing as increased autonomic nervous system flexibility. Actually, what most people need is down regulation, because we're so adrenalized most of the time anyway, that to really step into your power, learning how to down regulate the adrenals, the autonomic nervous system, creates the space within which one can become powerful. So I like to talk about flexibility. I like to talk about anti-fragility, which is a very important concept and is distinct from resiliency. And it's important to understand the difference. So I like to talk about those more because they imply this ability to roll with the punches, but also to become stronger as a result of exposure rather than just simply be worn down by. So an example of that is the trees in the Arizona biosphere, where they created this dome to replicate long-term what it might be to live on Mars for 6 months. And the trees kept on falling over. So they had to wire them up because they had no wind to resist. So there was no need for them to develop anti-fragility. So all biological organisms need a degree of stress and resistance to lean into, like those amazing trees you see on cliff faces that are leaning into the wind.
Welcome back to Biohacking Eve, Health Optimization for Women with Judith Mueller, where we shine a light on everything that will help you reach your best self as a woman, as unique and individual as only you can be. Live long and prosper, my friend. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we have Stefan Chmelik from Sensate, who will be telling us a little bit about the vagus nerve and what it does, and a couple of interesting things that you definitely have not heard about the vagus nerve yet. So Stefan has been a doctor for 35 years. He's actually practiced on Harley Street for the last 15. And for those who are not in the UK, Harley Street is basically the street in Europe where all the best, the brightest, and most famous doctors congregate. Stefan, welcome.
Judith, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about your practice and the kind of things you found there.
Yeah, I formed New Medicine Group really in recognition of the need for integrated healthcare. I was really noticing that patients were being told one thing by a kind of group of more holistic practitioners and then something else by their consultants. And they were having to make decisions that they weren't really qualified to make. So the whole intention of the New Medicine Group was to have a group of expert practitioners who were also holistically minded and integrated minded. So that's what we did. We were the best integrated healthcare team in Europe, I would say. I did some amazing kind of groundbreaking work, did a lot of the early work around things like fascia as a sensory organ, the importance of breathing, cold water exposure. There were many elements that we really, I think, pioneered in clinical practice, most of which have gone on to become mainstream or will become mainstream in the next 10 years. It takes about 10 years for a concept that's a bit new to break through to the mainstream. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that most of what people here are being told is already 10 years out of date.
That's always good to know. And I find it interesting, especially when you talk to the newly minted doctors who've been in training 10, sometimes 15 years by the time they've got their specialty. And the stuff that they were learning 50 years previously was already 40 years old in the textbook. So it's very interesting to see where this is going. So tell us about the vagus nerve and tell us where the Sensate comes in there.
So yeah, you would imagine that the vagus nerve had just been discovered. Like they discovered another planet, I think, didn't they? As this sort of something that was hiding in the shadow of another planet. You would think it was like that, but actually, I suppose like that planet, it has always been there. And of course, we've talked about the vagus nerve in anatomy for hundreds of years. But in the last decade or two, the role of the vagus nerve, and as the largest component within the autonomic nervous system, has been very much understood in more depth, has been elaborated upon, and its role in well-being in particular, and regulation of stress and emotional change, massively extends its scope beyond what the answer you might get if you asked a neurologist, what does the vagus nerve do? Which is really quite, the answer would be a couple of paragraphs. There's a lot of people now who talk about the vagus nerve as being the nerve of well-being. I think the way I like to think about it is that it mediates your internal world with the external, which is why it's so important. And we've had a vagus nerve for hundreds of millions of years. We've only had what you might call a human brain for about 1 million years. So that kind of tells you what you need to know, which is vagal nerve function, and therefore the importance of vagal tone, which is the autonomic flexibility of your vagus nerve, is infinitely more hardwired into your cellular structures and your body mind than the brain. But the brain is very sexy. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of money, a lot of interest in what do we do about the problem of the brain, because it is a problem, because nobody understands the brain, no matter most neurologists would say we don't know the first thing, although we think it might be the most complicated structure in the universe. Of course, there's a lot of interest in it, but I think the problem then is that you end up with this kind of brain in a jar view of the human body, that we're just brains that have these bodies that are there to carry us around, whereas in fact we've had bodies for hundreds of millions of years. And what we call the brain is quite a recent arrival on the scene. So although it's tremendously valuable, it's very far from the beginning and the end of the story.
So tell us about the beginning or the end of the story. What happens when the vagus nerve is not happy?
Excellent questions. Stephen Porges talks about, the developer of polyvagal theory, talks about autonomic flexibility, which is a term I like, actually. So we use, and most people use the term vagal nerve tone. And we talk about vagal nerve toning as opposed to vagal nerve stimulation. So I do make a distinct distinction between those two things. So vagus nerve stimulation is a medical procedure involving either implantable, like pacemaker devices, or devices where you can taser yourself on the neck or the ear. So it's using electrical stimulation, and it's really not that much advanced. And I'm being a bit crude here, but it's not that much more advanced than galvanism and making a frog's legs twitch by passing electric current. So Sensate, my technology, uses sound. So my whole hypothesis and my clinical experience, as someone who was taught to meditate at a very young age, somebody who's been meditating for well over 50 years, is that sound is probably the key to the universe. And that the body and the nervous system respond incredibly profoundly to sound. That can be positively or negatively profoundly. Sound can be used, and is used in films, etc., to make people feel particular emotions: love, sympathy, fear, compassion, empathy. We understand, and it's well understood, how you manipulate frequency to reproduce certain feelings of people. And your question was about the vagus nerve. So this is a kind of all my answers are sort of fairly roundabout satellite answers. Because of where the vagus nerves runs anatomically, vagus means wandering in Greek, so it does go all over the place. Starts in the brainstem, 10th cranial nerve, goes down mostly through the left ear, through the throat, innervates all through the chest and abdominal viscera. And actually, although you won't see this in the books, it does go right down into the pelvic floor. So I've dissected it out. I've seen this, but that's not normal. Typically described within its anatomical pathway or its function. So actually, there is a vagal nerve function on sexual and bladder and urinary genital aspects, as well as autonomic function. So when we talk about the gut-brain axis, the relationship between the brain and the gut, which is what's central to irritable bowel syndrome, we are essentially describing the anatomical pathway of the vagus nerve. That is literally the gut nerve, the brain gut axis. So having good, elevated, high vagal tone, which is the same thing as increased autonomic nervous system flexibility.
When you say flexibility, so stimulation is you apply some sort of stimulation, something happens. When the stimulation goes, the effect goes, basically. When you say you've got the tone, you've got the flexibility, that gives you, as the human being carrying the vagus nerve around in your body, more
Yep,
flexibility in terms of how do I want to react to a situation. That's both autonomously as well as not, basically, so consciously and subconsciously.
exactly. So a nerve can upregulate or downregulate. It can upregulate to make us creative, communicative, social, work harder. That's what most people don't tend to, although that's what they search for because that's what they think they need. Actually, what most people need is down regulation because we're so adrenalized most of the time anyway, that to really step into your power, learning how to down regulate the adrenals, the autonomic nervous system, creates the space within which one can become powerful. So that's why, so either autonomic flexibility or autonomic resilience. I'd kind of avoid using the term resilience a bit these days. So I like to talk about flexibility. I like to talk about anti-fragility, which is a very important concept and is distinct from resiliency. And it's important to understand the difference. So I like to talk about those more because they imply this ability to roll with the punches, but also to become stronger as a result of exposure rather than just simply be worn down by.
And I think
That's
this
the,
was Nassim Taleb who coined anti-fragility.
yeah, I don't know whether he's the
Yeah,
guy,
I've read that.
Anti-Fragile, exactly.
Yes,
Yeah, he wrote
highly
probably
recommend
the
that.
most popular book on it. Can't honestly remember whether he quoted it as material. He's certainly the person mostly associated with it. Okay, I guess it's worth saying it here then. So you can build something which is hugely resilient. You can build a machine that you can punish a lot before it breaks down. But eventually it will break down and it doesn't get stronger as a result of the things it's exposed to. So an example of that is the trees in the Arizona biosphere, where they created this dome to replicate long-term what it might be to live on Mars for 6 months. And the trees kept on falling over. They had to wire them up because they had no wind to resist. So there was no need for them to develop anti-fragility. So they just fell over. And I think all biological organisms, and this is the thing, anti-fragility applies only to biological organisms. All biological organisms need a degree of stress and resistance to lean into, like those amazing trees you see on cliff faces that are leaning into the wind and have these
This
deep
comes
roots.
and this comes back to any organism being hardwired for energy conservation. So if you don't need to develop these roots to be literally deeply rooted against the wind, they're very
Yeah.
energy intense, so you just don't develop them. Okay. So how does this, so coming back to the vagus nerve and coming back to the sensate, and I think I found very interesting that you said sound is the key factor. Because I've seen a lot of other devices. You mentioned the pulsetto, for example, which is the, you put it around your neck and you get this little electrical stimuli. And as I said, I'm a big fan of the Sensate myself. Basically, for those who haven't seen it yet, it looks like a little pebble you put on your sternum. It vibrates, and you're also playing some music in the app, and the music is basically syncing with the pebble. So the kind of music and the kind of vibrations that you're getting are working together. I like to equate it to a little bit of a sort of a personal gong bath, basically. Like I have a sort of
Mhm.
singing
Yep.
bowl on my sternum or someone playing that for me. So understand when you say sound, obviously the app plays some music and the vibrations of the sensate itself. Obviously vibration sound is a wave, is a certain vibration, but tell us more about the sound concept, how that all works together.
Yeah. The universe is made up of frequencies. So then things are only differentiated by the frequency that they vibrate at. That's not woo at all. That's just quantum physics. And something the human beings have done forever, probably, and animals do before that, including birds and bonobos and all kinds of creatures, is produce sound and then find ways to make it resonate and increase the low frequency element, the infrasonic element. So human beings have chanted, sung for who knows how long, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years. And that's been codified into some very specific spiritual or religious traditions, as hymn, as oming, as mantra. But they all have the meaning, the importance of ritual is a guy called Zygalites, Professor Zygalites, has written extensively about the power of ritual. So ritualizing, chanting and oming within the context of a practice also augments its power. But just simply making the chest vibrate, the column of air inside the chest, by making that vibrate and creating resonance, you have tremendous upregulating action on the vagus nerve, which runs right behind the whole autonomic nervous system. But the vagus nerve is the longest branch, runs right behind the sternum, the chest bone, which is where the sensate sits, very much in the center of the chest, which is a very important acupuncture point in Chinese medicine. It's an important chakra point in Indian Ayurvedic medicine. And basically, I go out into nature, I sit on the land, and I record samples, and I develop or receive what we call soundscapes. And then we come back and we record these. And we record the normal bit that you hear, and that's on the app, and you listen to that through headphones, although it's mixed using bilateral music sound and spatial sound and various other neuroacoustic properties, so that it has very powerful effect on the heard part. But then that's synchronized with the resonance from the sensate on the chest, so that you have this whole body, very powerful experience. On the basis that I have this hypothesis, which is that only around about half of the sound is a heard experience, and about 50%-ish is also a felt experience. But when you're wearing headphones, you don't get, or indeed, even if you're listening to music ambiently, you don't get that. Of course you don't. You only get the compressed airwave portion of the sound. And the felt part, the tactile, haptic part, is probably more important, certainly from the point of view of changing how we feel about things and changing our behavior.
And coming back to, you just said the sensate upregulates. I thought what we wanted is to downregulate.
We focus on downregulation. And what we see with sensate is typically after even a first 10-minute session is you get brain, and as I've already said, I don't bang on about the brain too much, but one thing, we have measured brain waves in people using sensate. And what we see is hemispheric synchronization, which is very similar to long-term meditators, but within 10 minutes. So it does, sensate does appear to be producing meditation-like effects in a fraction of the time, and for people that can't meditate, which actually is most people, is my experience of meditation, teaching it.
Mine as well, yeah.
Most people find it incredibly hard to meditate. Sorry, that was a slight digression. What was the actual question?
The question is, we previously said we don't want to, people think they want to upregulate, but actually they're looking to downregulate. And then we said the sensate upregulates. So I just wanted to double check whether that's going in the right direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it can do both. There is some content on the app which is more aimed at waking up in the morning or upregulating. The majority of it is downregulating, relaxing, de-stressing, and going to sleep. Because my clinical experience is that is absolutely what people need. The problem with feeling stressed, overwhelmed, and anxious is that you don't know you are until you're not. So that's something we see quite a lot. People saying, I had no idea how stressed, intense, and anxious I was. People who have literally never experienced calm in their lives.
Yeah.
And it's like me trying to describe to you what water feels like if you've never experienced water. How can you? I can use words to try and tell you what that's like. But until you actually put your hand in water, you have no idea what it feels
I've had a very beautiful story. There's a friend of mine who was from Pakistan, and she was visiting me in UK, and we were going to Wales, actually, to the Brecon Beacons, and there was just a tiny bit, like just a tiny bit of snow. And she's never seen snow before in her life, in
Um,
actual real life. She sees it in movies, etc. She got so freaked out by it. I'm like, give us a month and a half to shovel this stuff. But it's just a very interesting experience. But sticking with sleep, actually, I think you mentioned you've done a study on sleep.
we have, although we never marketed it as a sleep device, because there is such an epidemic of sleep disturbance, it's often the final downstream manifestation of the overwhelm, stress, and anxiety that's in people's lives. They run around stimulating themselves, even if they're avoiding stimulants, they're then adrenalized, blue light exposure at night, and then they go to bed, and of course they can't sleep. Now, this is hardly surprising. And because women's myelin sheath is different to men's, women are even more potentially sensitive to this than men are. So, yeah, light exposure, particularly blue light exposure, is something which one needs to be acutely aware of. There is an absolute global, obviously more European, American, Australian countries, but of sleep disturbance. Yeah. And there's a huge cost to this, personal and societal. People aren't sleeping enough, are inefficient, they're unhappy, they get ill sooner. So the cost to them is massive. The cost to the country they live in, the society they live in, is incalculable. And it tends to make people rather miserable and unhappy. So that then rubs off on the people around them. So they're also not that nice to be around either. Most people probably aren't getting enough sleep. So quite naturally, it became one of the areas that people really started using Sensate for and reporting great results. So we did a couple of studies. One study we did showed that after 2 weeks, people slept for an hour longer per night, and they fell asleep half as fast.
And when you say
I
this,
beg your pardon, they fell asleep in half the time. If you don't look at sleep studies, it's hard to appreciate how big a result that is, an hour a night. Often you see sleep studies and it's, oh, well, yes, and on average, they slept for an extra 7 minutes a night kind of thing. But no, our users slept for an hour a night and they fell asleep in half the time. So that is, if one extrapolated that to a much bigger population, that would be a massive outcome.
when you say an hour a night, this is a net or gross sleep time. So this is time in bed as actual time asleep, deep sleep,
But
light sleep,
time
sleep.
asleep, although we weren't strapping people to machines, ECG machines, time asleep, although we couldn't say what stage of sleep they were in. But frankly, there's also quite a lot of evidence showing that the more people track their sleep, the worse their sleep is.
Okay.
So
Why
one
is
of the
that?
best things, if you're not sleeping very well, one of the best things to do is to stop tracking your sleep.
Why is that? I would have thought that this obviously there's certain selection bias in terms of people tracking other ones they're more interested in, etc. More health.
Yeah, there's different theories as to why that might be the case. One is that it might just simply make people more anxious. As I say, my experience is we need to relax and let go rather than become more goal focused. So
Yeah.
then making sleep something that you can fail at can increase anxiety enough to stop people sleep. Of course, chances are you're also looking at a phone, your phone by your bed, therefore.
Yeah.
And I strongly recommend that people don't have their phones or their TVs in their bedroom.
I'm with you on that one. You mentioned myelin sheaths are different for men and for women. So myelin sheaths, it's basically a fat layer that insulates the nervous system to make sure the nerves can fire faster and better.
Yeah, it's like the way I like to think about it is it's like the plastic insulating coating around the cable. So if that degrades, as we know, your electrical device can go up in flames or spark. And that's essentially what happens in things like multiple sclerosis. The myelin sheath starts to break down and lots of symptoms can develop. And it is indeed this fatty substance. I think one of the greatest cons that was ever perpetuated on the human race really was the conflation of body fat with dietary fat. And part and parcel of that, obviously, is the perception of the female body and our attitudes towards what we now call fat or round bodies. There's no doubt about this. And low fat foods and low dietary fat leads to poor outcomes for women. In fact, women who have artificially lowered cholesterol live shorter lives. They're
When you say
more likely to die younger.
artificially lowered, as in through statins or through following a low-fat diet?
Well, I mean, obviously, if one followed an excessively low-fat diet, then you could also develop good cholesterol in general, but particularly statins with women. Because bear in mind, as I'm sure you know, that most medical trials and most drug laboratory reference ranges are based on white middle-aged men. So when women are being tested or when women are taking drugs, the doses and the reference ranges are completely wrong. And that's also, that's white men as well. So then there's the whole issue of, we know this, that different ethnicities have different reference ranges also.
Yeah.
And then in terms of fat, even if we bear in mind that pretty much all hormones are fat soluble, then if you have insufficient intake of fat or fat level in your body, then you can't synthesize or obtain hormones. And some things that we don't call hormones are hormones, like vitamin D really is a hormone.
In what sense?
By chemically, but also because of the network of functions it has on the body. So vitamin D is essential for pretty much every cell in the body. Pretty much every metabolic process in the body requires vitamin D, and it's fat soluble. And so without sufficient fat intake, you can't retain vitamin D.
So why would it be considered a hormone rather than a vitamin, especially if it's called vitamin, which is obviously confusing?
Yeah, it is. I think some things were named and they haven't been changed. You don't produce vitamin D in the body, whereas you tend to, generally speaking, you do, of course, to some degree of sunlight. Most vitamin D is dietary. And we tend to think of hormones as substances which are produced by endocrine glands in the body. But in terms of its structure and the functions it has on metabolism, it's very helpful to think of it as a hormone-like action. And there's very few plants. Vitamin D particularly is a very tricky one. So people know with vegetarian or vegan diets, people are aware of B vitamins and B12, but actually there are very few plant sources of vitamin D. Mushrooms is virtually the only one. And you'd have to eat a lot of mushrooms. And living in England, there's only a few days of the year where the sun is bright enough to get your vitamin D requirement.
Summer fell on a Tuesday this year, yes.
Now, a few days of the year being in the sun is fine, but most of the year not. So this is why Vikings have blue hair and blonde skin, blonde hair and blue eyes, blonde hair and blonde skin, right? Because they needed to get every last drop of sunshine to get the vitamin D, and they had a very dairy-rich diet, which is one of the main sources of vitamin D. Yeah,
and it's interesting when you talk about the Vikings. So, for example, with dosage recommendation, or when you have people with darker skin, basically, but they're now living in somewhere in Europe, in England, for example.
Yes.
And they're actually not very good at synthesizing vitamin D, even on the few days that we do have sunshine. And again, this is not even in any sort of dosage recommendation. Again, testing, very important to also be aware of your genetic heritage.
Absolutely. So the whole point of darker skin is when you're in the sun all day.
Yeah.
So if you're not in the sun all day, because your parents or grandparents were brought here to work here in the 50s or whatever, then the vast majority of people will benefit from taking a good vitamin 3 supplement, in a reasonable dose.
T3. And coming back to statins and cholesterol, what would be a good range from your experience for women to see? What's a good range? What's an acceptable range before you would say, actually, we do need to do something, whether that's dietary, whether that's statin related? And what's a good range? And if you're not in a good range, what would you do?
I can never remember the numbers for reference ranges, so I couldn't give you a number offhand, and it probably wouldn't be very responsible to do so. But it's important and useful to understand the role of fat in the body and the role of cholesterol in them. So cholesterol isn't something you eat. That's the thing that is really important to understand. Cholesterol is a natural inflammatory substance which your liver produces. Now, some people say that, okay, yes, but you find it at the sources of inflammation, which is true. But some people say, well, that's a bit like blaming the firemen for always being at a fire. They didn't start it, right? But they go there to try and put it out. So there are different types of cholesterol. There's many types. There's the essential fatty acids, B6 and 3 and 9 and 12, and arachidonic acid. There's various different ones, and you need those in the right kind of balance. One of the issues with the modern diet is it's very seed fat dominant as opposed to animal fat dominant, so from fish and from other sources. And that's a problem because we eat a lot of seeds, grains and seeds, and a lot of the food is processed with grain and seed oil. And then grain and seed oils are used to make things taste tastier, because they have mouthfeel, because things with no fat in them basically taste tasteless because it's fat that retains flavoring of things. Fat and salt. Fat and salt are essential to almost every flavor. So you don't want wildly out of kilter HDL and LDL, high and low density lipid ratio numbers. I think looking at the overall ratio, though, is more helpful than looking at the individuals. So what is the balance of HDL to LDL? What's the HDL? What's the cholesterol ratio? And and without giving specific numbers, that people can establish that well enough themselves. And then usually looking at, obviously you can decrease intake of the seed fats, because that's usually where the problems are the grain fats, and potentially increase ingestion of the good fats. So if you're not vegetarian, that's things like meat. If you're vegetarian but you have meat, eggs and dairy, then that's egg yolks. Eggs, actually, you should be separating the two, but eggs with a soft yolk. You don't want to cook the yolk on an egg. So, poach it or whatever you're going to do with it, but don't cook the yolk because then it oxidizes it. Dairy, really good quality butter. The thing about dairy is that it's one of the 3 most adulterated foods in the world, which are olive oil, dairy, and honey, are the world's 3 most adulterated food. The vast majority of those 3 foods that you see in the shops aren't what they say they are. So dairy is great if you eat dairy, if you can get hold of a good source, which for me tends to mean A2 Jersey, unpasteurized, unhomogenized raw milk, and cream, which you can then make your own butter out of. But I appreciate that's quite a big ask. So for some people, it's easier just to avoid it.
And A2 is so difficult to get hold of, because I know they've got it in Austria relatively frequently. I can sometimes get it in the south of Germany, in the north of Germany. I can't even find grass-fed pasture raised, etc., etc. That is already very difficult just because all the pastures are somewhere else, basically. So that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Actually, an interesting one that always seems to fall between the cracks, coconut oil. Technically, it's a plant fat, but how do you classify that as good, bad, in between?
I think, although obviously we've moved on a little bit, it's not that long until, or it's not that far back that the first non-indigenous people were eating coconut. It's only a couple 100 years maybe, which is not very much in evolutionary terms. So And if you look at where coconut comes from and the really quite small populations that would have been used to that growing up and would have the genotype and potentially the microbiome to digest. I don't know this for certain, but in terms of the blood group diet or the genotyping diet, I would say that coconut is suitable almost nobody.
Okay.
So in
So you
terms
would
of milk
much
replacement,
rather,
I generally
yeah.
recommend oat milk for people that don't want to consume dairy milk. If you want to have butterfat, but you don't want to have the milk element, you can have ghee. There are there's good ghees around that you can buy, or you can make your own easily enough with organic butter. Otherwise, vegan sources of good fats are the nuts and the seeds, so sesame, hemp, sunflower, etc.
But not the oil, only the actual
But well,
nuts and
both. So
seeds.
nut butters as well. Walnuts. The only proviso I think I would add to that is I like to suggest to people that they eat from food that's produced in the land where they come from. So having cashews is not really, and very few people, I imagine, listening to your podcast live in a country where cashews are grown. And actually, if you look into the sustainability and the ecological and social and cultural elements of cashew production, you might not want to eat avocados as well. Unless you're living in California or Morocco, should you be consuming avocado? Certainly, they don't grow here. But walnuts, fabulous. Sesame or hemp. Let's put sesame aside for 1 minute, but hemp is a fantastic oil. Flax, I'm not sure about flax. It's a funny one. So again, it's only recently we've been consuming it. We've been cricket bats and other wood items for quite a while, but we've only been consuming linseeds for a relatively short period of time. But hemp seeds, amazing.
Okay. And coming back to cholesterol and inflammation, I've seen this time and time again where people are saying, look, I'm doing everything by the book. And obviously, by the book means there's a lot of conflicting opinions. Some say have the coconut oil, some say don't have it, some say have this, have that, etc. So it's not very clear to start with. But if you have someone who comes to you with saying, look, I've had this inflammation rampant or otherwise, but it's been chronic, I'm doing everything by the book, I'm sleeping, I'm eating the way I should, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, where would you start looking as a doctor?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think the first place to look is, what do they mean by inflammation? Because people use that word a lot, most of the time wrongly. It's a bit like the way people use the word detox. It's it's a more acceptable way of saying weight loss. So detoxing is something else we can talk about. But inflammation, obviously, inflammation is a very specific physiological response. You twist your ankle, it becomes red and inflamed. You can have an inflammatory gut issue like Crohn's disease, or IBS isn't an inflammatory condition. It's one of stress and anxiety and spasm, but it's not due to inflammation, although sometimes inflammation can be present with it. It's not actually an inflammatory process. And inflammation can develop in response to autoimmune disease, so things like certain types of rheumatoid arthritis, etc., lupus, and other psoriasis, other diseases of that nature. So I think it's important to understand what somebody thinks they mean when they're saying inflammation, because if they then start looking up anti-inflammatory diets and they haven't actually got inflammation, then they're going to be going down the wrong road before you even start, obviously. So I think that's where I would start. Do they actually mean inflammation? And if they don't, what are we actually looking at?
What is your definition of inflammation in the sense of what would you look at in testing, whether that's blood markers or otherwise?
So inflammation is, in Chinese medicine terms, we talk about shu and shi. So deficiency disease and excess disease. So inflammation is by definition an excess condition. It's too much of something. And a lot of what we see is people who have too little of something. Yeah, they might feel that they've got too much of something in the same way that too much coffee can make you feel a bit hyperactive. But I don't think, but that's not that empty energy, isn't it? It's not grounded. It's not actually an excess of anything. It's just a flushing upwards of energy that will dissipate. So for me, if we're talking about non-physical inflammation, so not an acute sprained knee or whatever, we're talking about internal or skin irritation. And bearing in mind that the skin is really a reflection of what's going on in the intestine. They are a continuous structure, like a polo mint in a way. Then so you're looking for blood, intestinal bleeding, nose bleeding, spitting blood, spontaneous bleeding can actually be deficiency or excess, but heavy menstrual bleeding, although it's not normally an inflammatory response, but there can be an inflammatory symptom that arises of heavy bleeding as a result of menstrual irregularity. And then things like incredible thirst, incredible hunger. On blood test results, maybe very elevated liver function and certain white blood cell irregularities, eosinophils, which you also see, for instance, with intestinal parasites. And yeah, it really depends.
Okay, so you found consult your doctor basically. But this is I think it's more again because I'm seeing this time and time again what people are saying. But I think you've got a good point when you're saying what is inflammation, what is what you're looking at, whatever is out of whack with your blood or otherwise testing. Is that actually inflammation? Is it something else? And is diet, obviously, yes, diet and sleep and all the rest should be dialed in, but that's not necessarily the point you should be starting to look at.
Yeah, and listen, doctors are always looking for an easier life as well. So doctors have started to use the term inflammation wrongly because they know that if they say that word, it's going to make consultation probably 20 minutes shorter.
They've only got 6 minutes, I think, on average in the UK.
GP, yeah. So, it's worth bearing that in mind. We get the meds we ask for. And doctors see dozens of patients, and it's easier for them to use certain emotive keywords because it enables them to reach a conclusion easier. So patients, to be empowered as a patient requires self-knowledge.
So so you go in, you have XYZ problem, you think it might be inflation or otherwise. You go into the doctor, have that doctor tells you you've got inflammation or whatever else they come up with in terms of buzzwords. What should you as an informed patient be asking for exactly? Again, you got 6 minutes on average.
Yeah. You might want a blood test. It depends obviously on what the symptoms are, right? You might want a blood test, but then you need... Some doctors don't mind when the patient says, I want this and I want you to measure my vitamin D and also look at my hormone profile once you're taking blood. And some of them but then some of them will feel really annoyed by that and think to themselves without saying it necessarily, who's the doctor here? And also within England, certainly, and in America because of the cost, the testing and the lab work is more and more rationed. So you might take 4 visits to your GP for them to finally say, okay, I'll send you for a blood test or I'll send you to a consultant. And if it's a consultant, there's then a 6-month waiting list. And the thing to understand is that nobody knows more about your body than you do. Doesn't matter. They can be a consultant with 50 years of experience. And they, of course, they might have seen more of your specific symptom picture than you have. But nobody knows how you're feeling better than you do.
So what would you, if you know something's wrong, you just instinctively feel it, but you don't actually know what you're asking for exactly. So I'm completely with you in sense of you're better body better than anyone. But again, you might not have that necessarily background knowledge. What should you be doing?
You know what? In medicine, people tend to think the problem is diagnosis, and it's really not.
Okay.
What's hard in medicine is getting people to change their behavior. And in fact, when it comes down to it, and if people are honest with themselves, which is no small thing to ask, people know what they need to do. Yeah, they know they need to stop drinking, or they know they need to get more sleep, or they know they need to work differently, or whatever it might be. They know they need to have meaning and purpose in their life because what they do is purposeless and meaningless. And actually, that's not a bad place to start. If your life has no meaning and no purpose, then you really need to have a good, hard look at your life, because nothing is going to make any difference until you sorted that out.
Basically, do the things that you know you should be doing and then come back.
Yeah. So the ability to self-reflect, the ability to be honest with yourself is hard, but nothing is more powerful. And this is where anti-fragility comes in, and also the role of silence and space and quiet. We spend a lot of time and effort distracting ourselves with technology, with devices, with relationships, with people, with eating out, with drugs, so that we don't have to sit with ourselves. So I've just come back from a year. I spent a year with a group of people on the land, and 12 days a couple of weeks ago, 4 days of which were on the land, on your own, doing what's called a vision quest. No company, no fire, no technology, no shelter, no food. And you just sit there without anything, just you and the weather, and the sheep and the cows and the birds. And you really notice our reliance on distraction and our reliance on comfort. So the way you become anti-fragile is by being less comfortable. Comfort is the antithesis of anti-fragility.
I think it was one of the Stoics who was actually quite well off, but then 3 days a month, he would change his fine tunic for the oldest rag he could find. He would live under a bridge and basically fast and just have a water fast for 3 days. And he would do that every single month just to have a bit of a reset, bit of a recalibration, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a good habit. Every culture, if you think about it, has a tradition of fasting, whether it's Lent, whether it's Ramadan. There is something in our cultural genes which seem to feel this is a good idea. And one of the biggest problems is easy access to calories. So we spent 5 million years evolving a taste for sweet things because they were so rare. And when you could get them, you would gorge on them because you didn't have freezers, right? Plums came out, and plums like 1 million years ago are not like plums now. They were much smaller, more sour. During the fruit season, you would eat all the fruit you could, and that would then be over for 9 months or whatever. Because we can have anything whenever we want it, but we've genetically evolved to seek comfort, then we continue to seek comfort. And the problem with comfort is it's bottomless. There's no such thing as too much comfort. But when you get that, whatever it is, bigger car, bigger, softer bed, nicer sofa, you just want the next one.
I like how the softer bed is your number 2. Importance of sleep. There we go.
Exactly.
Now I'm with you on that. Okay. Coming back to, you mentioned the myelin sheath was different for men than it was for women. How was it different and why?
So men and women have different fat ratios.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I was alluding to earlier on, but didn't finish, is that it's tragic that the fat reduction has been foisted on women, where actually it'd be much better foisted on men. And women that really shouldn't be reducing fat and definitely shouldn't be having low fat foods, which are this terrible, terrible thing.
You're not saying there's a physiological difference in
there
the
is
myelin
also
sheath?
yeah, so women have a higher fat body ratio because they're meant to have a higher level of fat in their system. They're meant to have. And that's then reflected, obviously, on, although male and female physiologies are essentially very similar, of course, there are differences as well. Size, muscle mass, connective tissues of fascia, which contains, and there's the kind of adipose fascia, the fatty abdominal fascia, and there's other fascia as well. And that distribution of that in women is different to men. The distribution, I realize I don't know enough, and it's an interesting point, so maybe I'll have to go and research that, what the difference in brain myelin is between men and women. I suspect there is a difference. I seem to remember there is, but I couldn't tell you what it is right now, so I might go and encourage your readers and your listeners to research that also. But what we start then straying into is the role of WAT and BAT, the white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. And then we're starting to look particularly at cold exposure, because that and fasting, which are two things which have become very trendy and also which seem to have the greatest ability to change WAT, white adipose tissue, which is usually abdominal fat.
The bad fat, essentially.
Yeah, the stuff you get around organs, into brown adipose tissue, which is the metabolic fat, which you particularly get between the shoulder blades, but you do get it other places as well.
When you say metabolic fat, what do you mean by that?
The brown adipose tissue is the one that gives you your immediate energy stores. So with white adipose tissue, with belly fat, with abdominal fat, or visceral fat, you have to start going into ketosis or extended fasts to shift that, along with exercise and whatever dietary changes. And even then, as many people will know, the body can adapt to that. Yeah, because it can think, okay, shit, I'm not going to get a meal over the next couple of days. I'm just going to store everything as fat. And in particular, if it's sugar, it's no fat. Dietary fat intake isn't the problem, at least not natural dietary fat intake. Of course, trans fats are a completely different question, but it's sugar and trans fats are the problem. And so increasing the shiver response, which is what you're aiming to do with cold water exposure, is what transforms white adipose tissue into brown adipose tissue. And the more brown adipose tissue you have, the higher the ratio, the proportion of brown adipose tissue, the better your metabolic resiliency. I'm going to use that word again because I quite like that. Your metabolic flexibility and resilience. But it doesn't need to be much, and it doesn't need to be heroic. So in terms of metabolic change, I think it's 2 minutes a day, 2 minutes, 3 times a week.
Like that,
is sufficient to produce metabolic change over time. It does need to be cold water up to the shoulders. You can't just go in wading up to your knees. 2 minutes with your head doesn't need to be underwater. And you should feel a bit shivery, but it's really important to dry up quickly because you will lose heat rapidly after coming out of. But go into the water, get cold, come out and get dry.
A lot of women would say, well, that's great, that's extra calories burned. So is there another reason to dry off quickly?
No, because you can become hypothermic. So you will continue to lose significant body heat, which is not a good thing because there's heat that burns up fat, right? There's no such thing. Yeah. So if you want to, losing energy and heat through going hypothermic is not helpful, which is, it's the same. If you think of the thyroid is a great example, right? So when the thyroid's underactive, there's insufficient heat in the body. Yeah. So people get bigger, they get sleepy, they get tired. When it's overactive, there's too much heat in the body. So they can't sleep, they're dry, they're thin, anxious. So the thyroid is the great regulator between excess and deficiency.
Okay. So coming back to actual regulation is a good point. We previously talked about upstream and downstream regulation. So in the sense that there's so many things that when your vagus nerve is, I'm just going to call it unhappy, that you can suffer from. And I think we previously talked about obviously migraines, sleeplessness. We've talked about, I think, menopausal symptoms where somehow related to that as well. If you can actually, and again, there's so many things when there's, I don't know, 5,000, just making number up, different diseases out there, you need 5,000 molecules to treat these, versus if we treat upstream, if we actually get people a little bit calmer, a bit more regulated, as it makes sense, as aware, we can actually prevent, reduce a lot of these things. Also, I think autoimmune diseases we talked about.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's exactly the right way to look at it. So vagal tone is, I'm sure that, of course, there's something that's upstream of vagal tone. You're really getting into some quite metaphysical areas there, but pretty much everything else that we're interested in is downstream of vagal nerve tone. So the vagus nerve controls the blood pressure, and it controls sugar metabolism, and it controls heart rate and heart rate variability, and it controls sweating, and it controls the movement of the diaphragm, and it controls breathing, and it controls peristalsis, and it controls urogenital function. That list I've just given, if you appended the pathologies that go with each of those, you would essentially have a compendium of most modern illness. So the vast majority of problems that people in the what we call developed world experience are due to unhappy vagus nerve tone, low vagal nerve tone. Everything from gut problems through to breathing problems, through to heart irregularity problems, through to insomnia, migraine pain, all those things are dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, of which the biggest part is the vagus.
And we've also said previously that both men and women have vagus nerves, but they act differently. Tell us more about that.
Well, yeah, so it's an interesting thing. And it factors into evolutionary development. Remember, bearing in mind that where we are now is a tiny blip of human development, let alone animal development, let alone world development. So the cultural changes in the last 1,000 or 2,000 years have been huge compared to the last couple of 100,000 years. I think they're now finding evidence for fire going back 150,000 years or something, whereas it had been 50,000. So they're finding that humans were, and human-like Homo sapiens were more advanced, going further and further and further back. And I love all these changes that are being found in archaeology and anthropology. So because of course these archaeological and anthropological theories were all white men from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so a lot of now they're being revised and reviewed, and new findings added. And as they say, all ologies advance one death at a time. So for there to be a review of the archaeological evidence, there to be a review of the anthropological evidence, the medical evidence, basically the professor whose cherished theories are based on his work has to die before somebody else can come along and say, well, actually, that's not true. So, for instance, an example I love is a lot of early tombs that they thought had child princes. Actually, they're just women. They're not small boys, they're women. But it was impossible for the archaeologists, men of those times, to contemplate that a woman might be a king or a queen ruling an area. So they said, well, they must be children. And there's a lot of stuff like that emerging at the moment. And we know pre-church, pre-Roman times that we lived in a much more balanced matriarchal culture. Things have gone, what have the Romans ever done for us? Things have really gone downhill since the Romans. But things also are very interesting and changeable now. So with more enlightened views towards the binary or non-binary nature of gender, really introduces a whole new interesting and fascinating angle into the discussion. But generally speaking, men tend to be larger, they tend to be stronger, they tend to be faster. So the theories that we base most of our information on are about men. So the flight or fight response, for instance. It's possible that women developed a tend and befriend response because that was more efficient than fighting or flighting. Yeah, fighting was not. Fighting wouldn't have been a great option. Running away would have had limited success. So actually, befriending and empathizing with and building a community around was much more likely to lead to your survival. And I think it's really interesting. I think, and I jokingly talked about the Romans and the church, but I think we are seeing a gradual return to much more female orientated values around reciprocity, around sustainability, around empathy, compassion, community. Because when you see these dystopian films about the collapse of civilization, it's always blokes with guns running around shooting each other. That might be what happens in the first period, but what it will then rapidly settle down into is people building community. Yeah, people with transferable skills like healthcare or like growing or like building a house, plumbing. These and people who are good community leaders, yeah, and can build compassionate, empathic communities around them. These are going to be the qualities that are important. And so there may or may not be good evolutionary reasons why women tend to be orientated in that direction. Bearing in mind that Darwin never used the term survival of the fittest. Actually, if you read his work, Survival of the Kindest is a much better description of what he's actually saying. So I think, and I do believe, and I hope that in 50 or 100 years' time, we will look back over the last millennium or two and see it as a bit of an aberration, actually. Because anything which is unsustainable, which our current system is, cannot be sustained indefinitely. That's just logical, isn't it? It has to be. If it's unsustainable, it can't be sustained. And I think we're moving towards the point where that reality is getting closer and closer.
And I think coming back to the sort of viewpoint, or rather restricted viewpoint theory as a way, if the last 1,000, 2,000 years is what we have data on, is what we have history books on, is the kind of stuff that we're teaching our children, because that's all we know, because that's all we have records on. I think it's interesting to see how we're actually evolving past that. Interesting. Stefan, last question from me. What are the 1 to 3 things that you wish your colleagues, your patients, potential patients out there would know, that if they knew that, if they actually followed that, would really move the needle?
I think the single most important thing is exposure to nature. There's, I think, no doubt for me in that. That's what we try to do through Sensate, using nature sounds, using recorded sounds. And I think the human fracture, the nature of the fracture of the relationship between human beings and the natural world is what's responsible for most of our woes. However you do it, I think all human beings need to move back towards a much more embodied, holistic relationship with nature. If that means starting with a pot plant or looking at a tree outside your window, great, and move towards actually being surrounded by, fully engulfed by nature. And then connection. Some people need it more than others, but it's very clear that human beings are community-based social beings who thrive when they cooperate. So having a really healthy network of friends and activities that you do is incredibly important. And that's where meaning and purpose come in. Because without that, what's the point? And if you have meaning and purpose in your life, then you're not really that bothered by the restrictions, because they're just minor inconveniences while you're doing the thing that has meaning and purpose. Whereas if you don't have any meaning or sufficient meaning and purpose in your life or in your job, and the fact that it's a demonstrable fact most jobs don't need to be done. People do them because that's what they're paid to do, but they don't actually need to be done, not really. And I think people know that and can sense when that's the case. So therefore, any inconvenience is intolerable because you're not getting meaning and purpose in other areas of your life.
Which comes back to the distraction, whether that's food, whether that's TV, whether that's smoking, anything else
Yes.
I wouldn't say that filled life with meaning because it doesn't, but that distracts from the fact that there isn't any. Interesting. Stefan, it was really lovely to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, you're so welcome. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining me on this transformative journey. Your presence in this community is truly valued. Now, you may not realize it, but your words hold immense power. They have the ability to reach others who may benefit greatly from the wisdom shared here. If you found value in what you heard, I kindly ask you to take a moment to subscribe to Biohacking Eve, leave a glowing review on your preferred podcast platform, and share Biohacking Eve with your friends and family. Your support helps spread the message of health optimization for women far and wide. Lastly, I want to express my gratitude to you for investing in yourself. By prioritizing your well-being, you serve as an inspiration to others. I'm eagerly looking forward to bringing you many more exciting episodes, and thank you for being a vital part of our community. Live long and prosper, my friend. The Biohacking Eve Health Optimization for Women podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be substituted for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of the healthcare professionals for any such conditions. In addition, the information on this podcast does not constitute investment or financial advice.